I live in Reading, which is a neighboring community to Woburn, where there was a cluster of children with leukemia that was identified by parents who lived in the city. And one woman in particular, Ann Anderson, and the minister of her church, who she went to for help, brought the cluster to light, and it was published in the newspaper. And I got involved when I was a young mother, and people in Woburn and neighboring communities in Massachusetts and all across the country became very concerned about the hazardous waste sites that were being identified by state and federal agencies at that time. This was in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and we were dealing with huge Superfund sites like Love Canal in New York, Times Beach, Missouri, and in Massachusetts we were dealing with Sil-Resman, Lowell, Baird and McGuire, and people became very concerned about what was happening with these sites.
In November of 1982, the EPA took soil samples from Times Beach to ascertain the severity of the dioxin contamination. On December 23rd, just 2 days before Christmas, their worst fears were realized.
EPA was receiving the initial results from the lab sampling that indicated dioxin concentrations as high as 100 parts per billion existed on the roadways.
I had no idea what dioxin was. I had no idea what it was used for, how it was manufactured. I only knew that a front-page newspaper article said dioxin, the most potent chemical known to man.
Times Beach was abandoned.
I am not moving until I get an answer why.
The former Hooker Chemical Company had used the ditch as a dump site for years, and then in 1978, mysterious liquids oozed from the ground into backyards, basements, and school playgrounds. A state emergency was declared, urging pregnant mothers and small children to evacuate. Love Canal became synonymous with toxic nightmare, and the world was watching.
President Carter today declared an emergency to permit the federal government and the state of New York to undertake the temporary relocation of approximately 700 families in the Love Canal area of Niagara Falls.
And later in 1980, President Jimmy Carter would sign the landmark legislation establishing the Federal Superfund to clean up toxic waste sites across the U.S.
One of the things that happened really in 1980 when federal Superfund was passed, and then of course also in our state in 83 when our state Superfund was passed, was that suddenly a whole new group of people got involved in environmental issues. And what people wanted was some level of comfort and certainty. I think the run-up, a big part of the run-up had to do with the Federal Act, which was passed in 1980, at the end of December 1980, Federal Superfund under the CERCLA Act. Because there had been a lot of these horror stories. There was Love Canal in New York, there was some of these incipient situations in Massachusetts, but there were these issues around the country. And so the first real action, and I think it was driven by Love Canal in those days, was this federal Superfund. Then the states started all looking at that legislation and said, well, wait a minute, that's probably a pretty good tool. So I think the states, Massachusetts of course being one, really looked at that model and said, we're going to model state counterpart legislation on that. And in fact, that's what 21E was.
Well, I started with this pretty quickly after I joined the department in March 1983. Mass General Law 21E was enacted at the end of that month, which gave the department, which was then DEQE, a legal structure and a $100 million bond fund to respond to oil and hazardous materials releases. And we already knew of a number of sites that had known contamination. Some were very serious, others were less so. But we also knew that for some of those sites, the communities that lived in the neighborhoods were worried. What were these sites? What did we know about them? What were the chemicals? What are they doing in their water? What are the impacts on the people who live in the houses and are breathing the air and drinking the water, and whose kids are playing, in some cases, at the sites?